Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. It's good to see you guys today. And today we're going to go back to the topic of personality after an interlude of 3 days talking about, or 3 episodes I should say, talking about Nietzsche, the philosophy of Nietzsche. And there's been some good reactions to those videos. I'm very glad of it. And in the future I will be making more videos about philosophers. And if you have any particular preferences about particular philosophers, also do let me know. So today we're going to be talking about the different styles that the FE function can embrace, and with specific reference not to Myers-Briggs as such, or not to the Jungian cognitive functions as such, but in relation to the model and system called cognitive typology. Which I have made no secret of the fact that this model is outside of the Jungian cognitive functions, my favorite model that's available, because in addition to the very useful tool of voltology to provide people with empirical data to identify someone's type, in other words, typing via visual cues, which I know is controversial among the broad personality community and including my community. If you leave aside the voltology and you look at the theoretical apparatus behind the voltology, you'll quickly notice that cognitive type have come up with some very useful nomenclature to enrich our descriptions of personality type. And I will illustrate this with this video today on the FE function, where I will introduce a really innovative and useful distinction which you will not find in Jung and you will not find in most models today, but which is nevertheless really a contributor to enriching our vocabularies when it comes to describing our own type and how that impacts our behavior and our life and other people's types. The distinction that I want to discuss today, as I suggested, is the distinction between what we might call adaptive FE and directive FE. Okay? And before I move on to that particular topic, which I hope will be of interest to you, let me just quickly remind you that I have written 2 books in the last couple of years. My book on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul, which you can get at the links below. It's a reference book on the type at this point. Links below, less than $10. And my new novel, The Infinite Castle, which is a very nice product if you're into Kafka, Dostoevsky, Murakami, Camus, existentialism, tortured souls that are also INFJ. Check it out. Links below, also less than $10, okay? And you can get it in both ebook and paperback format. Thank you for your support. Don't forget you can also support me on Patreon. Massively helps the channel. Thank you so much to my supporters. So, when you read Jung, you get the sense that the FE function is a rational function. So that's something that a lot of people in the first place don't necessarily know, is that they assume that the T functions are the rational functions and the F functions are the emotional functions. Now, hopefully at this stage, by this point on this channel, we all kind of agree that understanding of things is inaccurate, and that the true understanding, is between the rational functions and judgments and the irrational functions of perception. So again, that's a slight innovation on Jung, by the way, if I allow myself this little pat on the back, because Jung speaks of the functions of judgment as irrational functions, and the functions of perception as irrational as in I, or whereas I prefer to think of the functions of perception as rational, or rational. A bit like the difference between immoral and amoral. Okay, now, so if we agree that FE is a rational function, it has a rational way of aligning one's judgments and choices with one's system of values, and that system is given externally, hence FE and not FI. We get to a slightly more precise understanding of FE than you will find in most places. However, With cognitive type, we, I think, attain a slightly more precise, a yet more precise understanding of FE, where we get to a more granular stage, where we are able to identify in people a difference between two, in fact, quite drastically distinct manifestations of FE in a person. And the idea is that you can be either adaptive in your use of FE or directive in your use of FE. Here, again, as in so many cases, we're speaking of a spectrum, of a continuum, where people who are like 100% directive and 0% adaptive are rare. People who are, 100% adaptive and 0% directive are equally rare or non-existent. These are just extreme poles. Most people are, in the middle. But most people are, tend to be more directive than adaptive, or more adaptive than directive. And the difference is, so the way that the voltology, when it comes to cognitive type, the way that the voltological tool proposes to capture the differences, again, is by visual cues. So, for example, two signals that, body language signals that will tend to provide evidence in the direction of someone whose FE is more adaptive is, I'll give you two examples of signals, and that is responsive nodding and polite smiling, right? Polite smiling is one signal, responsive nodding is another signal. So imagine that you're having a conversation and you're talking and you're expressing yourself. So if you tend to kind of nod when someone's talking, for instance, and you want to indicate that you are really listening to what they're saying and you want to signal your approval, say, or at least the fact that you are intent on taking in the information, the responsive nodding is an indication of adaptive FE, and the polite smiling as well. You do some polite smiling when you speak. So you'll notice that I do both. In fact, you might have noticed more so the polite smiling, but the responsive nodding, you might notice it more maybe if I'm kind of being interviewed by someone or if I'm in conversation with someone. In fact, cognitive type has identified me as as an FE user, in fact, as an FENI user of the adaptive persuasion. The directive type is different use of FE. And one particularly interesting signal that the cognitive type proposes for directive FE, the directive version of FE, is a stern expression, and by elimination, an absence of polite smiling and responsive nodding, but a stern expression is one signal. Now, if you think of Jordan Peterson, for instance, take me as an example of an adaptive FE user, but you have lots of examples of adaptive FE user. If you know Rooney Mara, you'll notice another adaptive FE user with a lot of responsive nodding, polite smiling, and so on. Jordan Peterson, most of us agree that he's not an FI user, that he's an FE user. There are some disagreements in the community, whether he's an ENFJ, an INFJ, or an ENTP, say, for instance. I think at this point, I'm pretty convinced that he's an ENFJ. A lot of people might think more INFJ. Now, one of the reasons why I became confident that he was an ENFJ and not an INFJ is, in fact, because cognitive type have provided us with the tool to distinguish directive versus adaptive. Because it is undeniable, if you embrace this particular nomenclature, that Jordan Peterson is a directive type of FE user and not an adaptive. He's going to be much more stern than politely smiling and responsively nodding. And again, there's other signals that I don't want to go into, but essentially the directive FE user tends to impose their vision, their FE vision, right? So you imagine that there's an FE vision of how things should be in terms of social interreactions and interrelations, okay? Like interactions between people ought to be regimented by certain kind of external rules. FE asserts its kind of external social values onto these. But there's two ways of approaching it: by harmonizing, by ensuring that you adapt to a particular scene so that you can guide people along a certain direction, but you do it through soft accompaniment, right? Soft power in a sense. That's the adaptive approach. I think that's my approach, and that's the approach of a lot of people in my community, I think. The directive FE user is not as, in some sense, it's not as diplomatic. It asserts itself more, which is why cognitive type, in a sense, suggests a very interesting hypothesis, namely that a lot of FE dominant people who are directive could be confused for T leads. So for example, a very directive ENFJ could be mistaken for an ENTJ. That frequently happens according to cognitive type. Now we may agree with this, we may not agree with this, but this is something that is a very interesting hypothesis to me, because it allows us, like I said before, to broaden and make more granular and fine-grained our understanding of distinctions between types. So instead of having like, oh, ENTJ versus ENFJ, we could have, yeah, well, there's ENFJ adaptive or ENFJ directive. What cognitive type suggests is that you'll find slightly more directives among ENFJs, in fact, and slightly more adaptives among ESFJs. Slightly more directives among INFJs, slightly more adaptives among ISFJs. Okay, there's reasons for that I won't go into. When it comes to ENTJs, INTJs, and all the FI users of this world, there's a distinction as well. Cognitive type doesn't use the distinction adaptive versus directive, which they keep for the FE domain. They use the distinction Seelie versus unseelie. Seelie being the equivalent of adaptive, and unseelie being the equivalent of directive, more or less. One way to think about the distinction between adaptive and directive, some people in the CT community, and I happen to be one of them in many ways, think that the terminology adaptive versus directive has advantages and flaws, because it is possible, if you like, for someone who's adaptive, who's emotionally unguarded, that's a very useful way to think about it too. Emotionally guarded, directive. Emotionally guarded users of FE can be very strong FE, but emotionally guarded, versus emotionally unguarded users of FE can be very strong users of FE, but emotionally unguarded. There's big phenomenological, experiential differences between two equally strong FE users. That's the idea. One of the challenges, there's challenges for every position, but one of the challenges of this distinction between adaptive and directive of users of FE is that, in fact, someone could be adaptive, focus on soft accompaniment, soft power, harmony seeking, but still be very proactive in pushing this. In some sense, they could be directively pushing this, whereas someone could be directive in the sense of emotionally guarded and serious and stern, and not be as effective or bothered with pushing their agenda. So in some sense, they could be less directive than we think. So what I mean is that the use of those words, directive and adaptive, it's up for debate, but what they capture, this different emotional attitude between guarded and unguarded, between, so to speak, open and slightly closed off, I think is a real gain. And I want to, I had an exchange with my Patreon supporters, my Patreon community, to try to get a sense of whether they identified more so as adaptive or directive. But now I'd like to run into all of you guys and see what you think, and whether you're slightly more directive or slightly more adaptive. In other words, slightly more guarded or slightly more unguarded. Maybe another way to capture it would be slightly more agreeable or slightly more disagreeable in your use of FE. Let me know in the comments, and let me know if you find that useful. I'll add a link to the Cognitive Type website, where they offer some clues as to understanding the distinction between adaptive and directive better. And as always, I would encourage you to take a look and some interest in cognitive type, because it's not just about voltology. In other words, if you reject the voltological aspect, there's still plenty to explore, theoretically speaking, that may pique your interest and more. So until then, I'll see you next weekend, guys. It's been great to have been able to release those videos for you. I really wanted to keep the videos going. And don't forget you can support me on Patreon, and I will see you next week. See you then, guys. Take care. Enjoy your Sunday. Bye-bye.